Shalem and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The border between Israel and Lebanon flared up this week as the leader of the Iranian-proxy Hezbollah, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, made good on his promise to retaliate for each time one of his operatives is killed in alleged Israeli attacks on Iranian installations in Syria. Israel, which counterclaimed that the Lebanese national killed in the Iranian facility near Damascus last week was unknown to it, tried to avoid escalation. Nevertheless, the escalation earlier this week on the Lebanese front seemingly demonstrated the fragility of the ceasefire along Israel's many frontiers. To analyze the current situation, we're joined from central Israel by Dr. Lerman, Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
Also joining our panel from another location in central Israel is Colonel in Reserve Miri Eisin, who is an Israeli public diplomacy, security, and intelligence expert at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism in Herzliya. Welcome.
Hello.
And I'm welcoming here with us in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. And Amir, I would like to immediately dive into today's topic. We saw a rapid escalation on Israel's northern front on Monday. This escalation was quite unique to the fact that despite all of the capabilities of Israel, the Hezbollah operatives who crossed into Israel happened to flee back unharmed. And it seems like Israel is making concrete efforts to de-escalate the situation, even though it seems like the situation is not necessarily over.
Indeed. So Israel has two Palestinian fronts in the west bank of the Jordan River, Judea and Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. It also has two or three fronts up north. That is Lebanon, especially Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. Iran, namely the Iranian nuclear effort and the Iranian entrenchment in Syria, which Israel is fighting. And Israel has two contradictory top priorities as it tries to juggle between all of those fronts. It wants to uproot the Iranians from Syria, and it wants to avoid, for the time being, an escalation in Lebanon. And what happened on Thursday a week ago was that these two priorities clashed with each other because, unbeknownst to it, a Lebanese national, a sort of a contractor, happened to be at the Iranian facility at Damascus International Airport, which Israel, according to the Arab media, has attacked that night. And because Hassan Nasrallah pledged that no matter where any of his operatives would be killed by Israel, he is going to retaliate from across the Lebanese border, Israel had to devise a way, as you put it, to de-escalate. And therefore, what it came up with was the opposite of the so-called body count from the war in Vietnam. And that is to have as few as possible casualties on either side, let this squad cross the border and thereby violate its sovereignty and perhaps achieve its intended goal, at least part of it, but let it run back home unharmed so that there will be no further retaliation, no cycle of violence.
Indeed. Colonel Eisin, I'd like to refer the next question to you. Even though Israel is seemingly trying to de-escalate the situation, talking with a third party and asking it to relay messages, calming messages to Hezbollah in order to avoid a wider conflagration, it seems like the media in Israel really managed to raise the victorious notion of Israel being able to thwart some kind of cross-border incursion. And at the same time, we look at the situation and we say, why not play down this whole event on the border, which was seemingly or relatively small in comparison to other instances that occurred in the last several months, and put it water under the bridge. As we know in the Arab culture, sharaf is something very important, and allowing Hezbollah to save face might have avoided situation in which we're currently at, where the situation that occurred and a possible conflagration may still occur in the near future.
I'm going to add into what Amir talked about before. I'd like to add in some additional elements. The first is the political situation in Israel. I cannot ignore the fact that yesterday the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister did a joint press conference where they said absolutely nothing, but they could show themselves together in harmony about a subject that all Israelis agree on, and that's security. So in this case, you're asking, why did the media hype it? I'm saying, why did the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, both in statements they made, and the fact that they were getting together to talk about it, the fact that they did this conference, this press conference, to me, that added a lot into the hype. The additional aspect that I want to add into what Amir said before is the psychological warfare. It's as if we're alone, we get to control it. Things are not so controlled. Things are not so you can define what's going to happen. As you said, we didn't intend to kill the Hezbollah guy, meaning we don't control everything. We also don't control their response. And part of their response is I think that they are better at psychological warfare, meaning the Israeli media may have hyped it, and I think that's based because of what happened with the Prime Minister and Defense Ministry, but then Hezbollah knew how to take it into the psychological realm.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, Israel has been in certain situations in the not too distant past in which it informed Hezbollah operatives through even calling them on their phones, sending messages on their private phones, asking them to leave the area, whether it was the vehicle instance where there was a targeted attack on that vehicle with Hezbollah operatives who managed to leave that vehicle. And according to various reports circulating, Israel informed them to leave the area in order to send a signal to Hezbollah. Israel is capable of attacking you. Know that we know where you're at. Know that we have the intelligence capability to act upon our interests, but at the same time, we're not interested in a wider escalation. Is that still true for today? Are we seeing a certain shift in that, or is there a game theater where one side sees it one way and the other side completely disregards that and acts according to its own interests wholeheartedly?
Well, the first decision Israel had to make, I believe, at the highest level, was whether we want to use this opportunity to hit Hezbollah hard in a period in which, there's no tourism in the north that would suffer as a result. The international attentions are focused elsewhere. For some people in Israel, it may have seemed like an opportunity, but ultimately, I think no Israeli leader is eager to get into an all-out war, the sort of experience we went through in 2006, for a really minor reason. If the day comes when we have to destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon, the IDF has been preparing for that quite meticulously. But to make that decision right now, against the background of political turmoil in Israel, of the coronavirus crisis, that seemed a dangerous decision to take.
Indeed.
At the same time, there was also an opportunity to send a very clear message to Hassan Nasrallah. You are a master of doing the minimal retaliatory act. We've had this twice before. In one case, we did lose 2 soldiers, an officer and a soldier, to a cornet launched from the top of its range. In another case, we even generated for the benefit of Hezbollah a charade of medical evacuation last year in order to give them the satisfaction that they've done something, while both sides actually knew that they did not. And this time also, the message was very clear. Hezbollah is in an extremely delicate situation. The majority of the Lebanese people are very angry with the mess their country is in. Much of it attributed to Hezbollah, the role of Hezbollah, the governance dominated by Hezbollah, and the manner in which Iran has used and abused Lebanese territory.
Indeed.
Moreover, The Iranians don't want to waste Hezbollah as an asset because much larger things are right now brewing between Israel and Iran over the nuclear question. And that's not the right time for them to actually go into an all-out confrontation. So their choice also was to do the minimal thing. And luckily, it's the nature of the terrain in that part of the eastern slopes of Mount Hermon, which we call Har Dov, and the Lebanese sometimes refer to as Sheba farms. It's the nature of the terrain that it's not that easy to hit a small cell or squad of people hiding between the boulders. So it was in both sides' interest to basically celebrate a success, because you saw parades in the streets of villages in Lebanon that they have avenged their dead soldier in Syria. And Israel celebrated the success of the very efficient work of the young, normally it's almost entirely young women, at the observation post, the individuals who manned the observation post, the electronic observation post, that detected the movement and foiled the penetration. So both sides were quite happy, quote unquote, to celebrate a relative success with no casualties and no need to escalate further.
Indeed, in reference, of course, to the young female soldier, 19 years old, from Division 91, who was able, even though lack of experience, to really spot the cell moving from the Shiite village on the border into the Sheba farms or the Mount Dov and this rocky area, very hard to detect movements there on a regular basis. But Mr. Oren, I'd like to move to you. To what degree, we all understand the reluctance of anyone in the region to go toward this instant, especially because of the coronavirus, the economic devastation that it has brought with it, also in Israel, also in Lebanon. Lebanon hasn't been stable for quite some time, but the situation is really dire there. And as Dr. Lerman has also mentioned, the instability in Lebanon has brought about a lot of anger towards Hezbollah, has brought fears and genuine concerns about the possibility of once again seeing the civil war reignited, something that nobody wants to see, not even in Israel, because instability in Lebanon obviously brings about instability to the border of Israel and may ignite a war for reasons that we don't want to go into. But to what degree do you see the current situation now, where Iran is still pulling the strings of Hezbollah? We heard both Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and alternate Premier and Defense Minister Benny Gantz speaking in veiled threats, not only to the sovereign nations of Lebanon and Syria, but also to the far threat of Iran, that it might not be out of the equation of war at this stage. To what degree is that heard in the halls of Tehran, in the Majlis, in the office of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei?
So a few points there. First of all, referring to that female soldier, the 19-year-old, sitting at her console, it helped that someone told her where to look, where the squad might cross the border. Now, Lebanon is in such dire financial troubles that the commanders of the Israeli units have seen recently a wave of Sudanese and other migrant workers who lost their jobs and their wages in Beirut, who simply take a bus to the Israeli border and try to cross, and in an effort to find work in Israel, which is a new kind of incursion brought about by the economic troubles, and Hezbollah is to blame for these troubles. And also the Lebanese Minister of Health happens to be Hezbollah's emissary to the cabinet, and he is also, and the movement itself is to blame, at least partly, for the coronavirus. Now, there are two concepts. One, which you mentioned, Sharaf, face and the other one is lethality. Everyone understands that when Nasrallah makes a promise, a pledge, much like Donald Trump, he wants to have this commitment fulfilled. Otherwise, it is not only an emotional matter, but when you are an authoritarian leader of a country or of an organization, and you don't make good on your promises, people might rebel, might have ideas regarding your control. And Nasrallah is a very sophisticated partner for a dialogue, much like Yahya Sinwar of Hamas in Gaza. So Israel knows how to send messages, partly through the media. Perhaps, by the way, during the first hour of this incident early this week, Israel wanted Nasrallah to believe that he has succeeded in the incursion, even causing Israeli casualties, so that he will stop the action. And therefore, Israel not only had smoked out the area, literally by shells, but also had Netanyahu and Gantz leave their Jerusalem offices and run to Tel Aviv and say publicly that the situation is very complicated, which is a code word for the Israeli casualties usually. And apparently Nasrallah took the bait and the operation stopped. Later on, of course, he has to reevaluate whether it's enough or not. But as Lerman mentioned, the helicopter during one of the earlier incidents, which seemingly flew Israeli casualties to a hospital, made Nasrallah believe that his actions succeeded. Now, lethality. The current chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, General Kochavi, is putting an emphasis on lethality on the battlefield when war takes place. If war does start between Hezbollah and Israel, Kochavi wants it to be very lethal on Hezbollah's part. But he doesn't want it to be lethal in the run-up to the war, if he can avoid the war. So there is a contradiction here. He doesn't want Hezbollah's squads to be killed right now and bring about the war which he wants to put off. If war does come, Hezbollah's lives will not be spared.
Indeed. Colonel Eisin, I'd like to bring in, again, Iran into the picture. Even though Israel's main threats currently are to the north, it seems like the northern border is unsafe for the stability factor, of course. The strings are ultimately pulled from Tehran. It seems like Iran is really making every effort to maintain some kind of control in Syria. It's making every effort to maintain some kind of control in Lebanon, but it's trying to avoid unlegitimate or to delegitimize its actions because ultimately there is a lot of domestic strife in both Syria and in Lebanon. To what degree do you see them excuse me?
Not only there, they are also facing a huge backlash in Iraq.
Correct.
Which has almost gotten out of their control. The war in Yemen that for a while seemed to go their way is at least, let's say, going nowhere for either side. The sense of an Iranian tide, of time working in Iran's favor, which was may have been the impression a few months ago, is certainly not the case now.
It's definitely not the case now. And I'd like actually to refer this question to Colonel Eisin, and I'll give you the chance to also to elaborate on that after Dr. Lerman, please.
So as I look at it right now, I'm kind of fascinated by, to me, how we undermine Hezbollah. Hezbollah was founded without an Iranian in the room. Hezbollah does not speak Persian. Hassan Nasrallah is a very charismatic, Arabic-speaking, Shiite Muslim, but Arabic-speaking Muslim. When he talks, people listen. I do not know right now, throughout the greater Arabic-speaking Middle East, a charismatic religious leader on the same level as Hassan Nasrallah. So when we ask about Iran, I'm not here to say I'm for Hezbollah, but I think that we are belittling the fact that Hezbollah has its own agenda, that I think it has schizophrenia. It is both Arabic-speaking, Lebanese, very strongly part of the Lebanese arena, and it is funded, inspired, part of the greater Shiite revolution led by Iran. When I listen to Hassan Nasrallah, I don't always hear Iranian, Persian, aspects. I also hear aspects that are both Muslim, but that they are also Arab. I think that Iran, as Eran was saying before, as Dr. Lerman was saying a moment ago, Iran has been very challenged in all of the arenas. I think that Hezbollah specifically was never a tool. And that's part of the challenge here, is how much is what you're investing in from the Iranian point of view going to do what you want at the point which is important for you. And I don't think that Iran can fully rely on Hezbollah.
Also, at a time when Hezbollah is losing its ground within the international community, it was recognized as an internationally recognized terror group in Germany, in England, and also its political offshoot. To what degree do you see Hezbollah actually holding itself as an organization which wants legitimacy, very much the same like other organizations in the region, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad?
So don't we have that problem that they are all defined as terror organizations by all of the countries and governments that matter? And within their different locations, you have that challenge that they are both a political player and they're absolutely a terrorist organization. I don't know if I stepped in here, Eran, to you.
No, fine. Actually, the irony was that until recently, there were more Arab countries which listed Hezbollah as a terrorist organization than European ones, or there was also the funny thing that some European countries spoke about the military wing as if it was not connected to the head, which is a very funny bird, there's a wing unconnected to its head. So the military wing was a terrorist organization, but the political organization, Hezbollah, was somehow not a terrorist organization. Some of this absurdity is now off. The British, the Dutch, the Germans, I think, have gone the right way. Mm-hmm. But the main issue, I think, now is that given the tremendous economic crisis that both Iran and, by the way, Syria are currently in, and Lebanon, of course, is almost a bottomless pit. Hezbollah, in their infinite wisdom, sometimes even Hassan Nasrallah, who's extremely clever, makes mistakes. And the mistake was they took over the Ministry of Health in order to siphon off the resources of that ministry to cover for the shortfall in Iranian funds.
Because at the time it was the biggest treasury, if you will, in Lebanon.
Well, there you go. And now they have the corona baby on their hands, which I'm not sure is what they actually wanted. Beyond that, the problem for the Iranians is that they're rapidly losing legitimacy in societies where they once were held to be the saviors. Iraqis looked up to them when they helped defeat Daesh. They now look to them at them as oppressors. In Lebanon, Hezbollah lost much of its luster in pushing Israel out 20 years ago, when they basically became the oppressors and complicit in the murder of the Sunni Syrian people. And the bitterness is very close to the surface.
Indeed.
So interestingly, what Netanyahu and Gantz said when they responded to the incident was something quite interesting. They said, "Dear Hassan Nasrallah, pray remember that once in your life you made a terrible mistake when you misjudged the response of Israel back in 2006.
Indeed.
You thought that Olmert and Peretz would not react the way they did. And you ultimately had to admit it, because Hassan Nasrallah faced a choice. Is he a bastard who brought a catastrophe upon Lebanon knowingly, or is he a fool who did not read Israel properly? He chose the second option, rightly so, and they warned him, don't make that mistake again. Don't misread.
And time will tell whether miscalculation will materialize into nightmares or whatnot, but we're drawing near to the end of the program. I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing statement. Mr. Oren, we'll start with you.
Hezbollah, which started much like the other movement, Amal, started by trying to help the oppressed Shiites against the stronger groups in the Lebanese society, the Maronites, the Druze, the Sunnis, became the strongest force within the Lebanese arena. It could possibly take over the country if it wanted to. It does not want to because it will lead to a renewed civil war, and even more importantly, it will make Hezbollah responsible and accountable. It cannot be a government of a member state of the United Nations and still call for the destruction of Israel. It will have to grow up. So it is trying to coexist between these contradictions.
In contrast to most people, I don't think actually Hezbollah is capable of taking over Lebanon. I think that the backlash to an attempt of such a proportion would be a lot more severe than this Shiite organization might think. But really a closing sentence from each of you. Colonel Eisin, we'll start with you.
I think that Israel is in a stage of mutual deterrence with Hezbollah. And that's not where we want to be. We want to deter Hezbollah. I don't think we want Hezbollah to be deterring us.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman?
And we need to keep our eyes focused on the Iranian challenge. That's the main story. This is why the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States was in Israel for a visit. This is the challenge for the future of the region, the Iranian nuclear project. That's at the core of everything, and everything else is subsidiary.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, and we'll absolutely continue to touch also on the Iranian topic next week. But I'd like to thank Colonel Eisin, Dr. Lerman, as well as Mr. Oren for being with us here today at the Jerusalem Studio panel, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.